I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, 34, and I've spent the last 8 years building my reputation as one of the youngest department heads at Johns Hopkins Hospital. But today, sitting in this cramped urgent care clinic in my hometown, I'm just another patient in a paper gown being dismissed by a doctor who clearly thinks I'm wasting his time. "Listen, honey," Dr. Morrison said, not even looking up from his chart. "I've seen dozens of confused patients like you this week. A little anxiety, some web research, and suddenly everyone thinks they're dying." He chuckled condescendingly. "Trust me, it's just stress." What he didn't know was that my medical license was sitting in my purse, along with my hospital ID that grants me access to some of the most advanced medical facilities in the country. He was about to learn that dismissing the wrong patient can have consequences he never saw coming. Like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better. The symptoms had started 3 weeks ago during my visit home for my nephew's graduation. At first, I'd attributed the fatigue to my demanding schedule. At Johns Hopkins, 60-hour days were nothing new in my department. But when the joint pain began, followed by the distinctive rash across my cheekbones, my medical training kicked in with alarming clarity. I knew exactly what this constellation of symptoms suggested. And it wasn't anxiety. "Doctor, I've been experiencing significant fatigue, joint pain in my hands and knees, and this facial rash," I explained, pointing to the butterfly-shaped discoloration across my nose and cheeks. "I also noticed some hair loss and mouth ulcers over the past week." Dr. Morrison barely glanced up from his clipboard, scribbling notes with obvious impatience. His examination was perfunctory at best, a quick listen to my heart, a cursory look at my throat, and a dismissive wave at my concerns. "MMMHMM," he muttered, not even bothering to examine the rash I'd specifically mentioned. "Any recent stress, new job, relationship problems?" The assumption stung. Here I was, presenting classic symptoms that any competent physician should recognize, and he was already writing me off as an anxious woman seeking attention. "Doctor, I'd like to request some blood work," I said, maintaining my composure. "Specifically, an honor test, anti-dsDNA, complement levels, and a complete blood count with differential." His pen stopped moving. For the first time, he looked directly at me with barely concealed irritation. "Listen, miss," he glanced at his chart. "Chen, I've been practicing medicine for 23 years. I think I know what tests are necessary." His tone was condescending, treating me like a child who'd been playing doctor. "What you're describing sounds like classic stress symptoms. Maybe some seasonal allergies thrown in. Nothing that requires extensive testing." I felt my jaw clench. In my 8 years at Johns Hopkins, I'd seen this exact presentation dozens of times. The combination of symptoms I was experiencing had a very specific differential diagnosis, and stress wasn't on the list. But the rash pattern I started is probably from new makeup or laundry detergent. He interrupted, already reaching for his prescription pad. I'm going to give you something for the anxiety, and I want you to get more sleep. Come back in 2 weeks if you're still feeling stressed. As he scrawled illegibly across the prescription pad, I realized he hadn't documented a single symptom I'd described. His notes would reflect none of the clinical details that mattered, only his predetermined conclusion that I was another hysterical female patient. That's when I decided he needed to learn exactly who he was dismissing. As I sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair, waiting for Dr. Morrison to finish his dismissive scribbling, my mind drifted to the framed photograph sitting on my parents' mantelpiece back home. 5 smiling faces captured at our last family reunion. Before I left for medical school, my parents flanked by their 3 children, all of us dressed in our Sunday best for what my mother had called probably the last normal family photo we'll have. She'd been more prophetic than she knew, growing up in Millbrook, population 8,400. The Chen family ran the most successful accounting firm in 3 counties. My father had built the business from nothing, and the expectation was crystal clear his children would carry on the legacy. My older brother Michael had fallen in line perfectly, earning his CPA and expanding the firm's corporate client base. My younger sister Lisa had married well and managed the firm's human resources, keeping everything running smoothly while raising 2 beautiful children. Then there was me, the middle child, who'd always asked too many questions and spent her summers volunteering at the county hospital instead of learning the family business. Sarah's going through a phase, my mother would tell concerned relatives when I announced my pre-med intentions. She'll come back to something practical once she sees how hard medical school really is. But I didn't come back. I thrived. 4 years at Northwestern, followed by residency at Mass General, then my fellowship and eventual department head position. At Johns Hopkins, each achievement met with polite congratulations, tinged with bewilderment. My family simply couldn't understand why I'd chosen such an uncertain, demanding path when I could have had security and predictability right at home. Doctors work all the time, my father had said during one of our last serious conversations about my career. They get sued, they burn out, they miss their children's childhoods. Why would you want that kind of stress when you could have a normal life here? The irony wasn't lost on me that Dr. Morrison had just prescribed anxiety medication for what he assumed were the very stress symptoms my family had warned me about. If only they could see me now, their accomplished daughter, being dismissed as neurotic by a small-town physician who probably made less in a year than I made in 3 months. My parents had stopped asking when I'd come home for good around my 3rd year of residency. The question shifted to whether I'd ever find time to get married, have children, settle down into the life they'd envisioned for me. My success became something to be politely acknowledged rather than celebrated, a source of concern rather than pride. She's probably making good money, I'd overheard my mother telling a neighbor. But what kind of life is that? Working all hours, dealing with sick people, all that responsibility. I just wish she'd find a nice man and settle down. The photograph on their mantel had become a symbol of everything they'd lost. When I chose medicine over their vision of my future, every time I came home, I could see it there, a reminder of the daughter they'd expected me to be, frozen in time before I disappointed them by becoming exactly who I was meant to be. Dr. Morrison tore the prescription from his pad with a flourish that suggested he was solving all my problems with one simple solution. "Here we go," he said, sliding the paper across his desk. Lorazepam, 0.5 milligrams, as needed for anxiety. This should help with all those worries you're having. I stared at the prescription in disbelief. He was treating me like a case study in female hysteria circa 1950, not a patient presenting with legitimate symptoms in 2025. The casual dismissal was insulting enough, but the complete lack of medical curiosity was professionally appalling. "Dr. Morrison," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "I want to be very clear about something. I'm not experiencing anxiety. I'm experiencing systemic symptoms that warrant investigation. The facial rash alone should prompt you to consider autoimmune conditions, particularly given my family history." His expression shifted to barely concealed annoyance. "Miss Chen, I appreciate that you've done some internet research, but I need you to trust my clinical judgment here. What you're describing, the fatigue, the joint pain, even this rash you're worried about, these are classic presentations of stress and anxiety in young professional women." Young professional women. The phrase dripped with condescension, as if my gender and career were character flaws that explained away my symptoms. "I've seen this pattern hundreds of times," he continued, leaning back in his chair with the self-satisfied air of someone who thought he'd cracked the code. "Career-focused women in their 30s, probably working too many hours, not taking care of themselves properly. The body manifests stress in all sorts of ways. You just need to slow down. Take these pills when you feel overwhelmed and learn to manage your work-life balance better." The rage building inside me was dangerous, not because I might lose control, but because I was starting to understand exactly how many other women had sat in this chair presenting with legitimate symptoms, only to be handed a prescription for anxiety medication and sent home to relax more. What about the hair loss? I pressed. The mouth ulcers? The joint stiffness? That's worse in the mornings. He waved his hand dismissively. Stress can cause hair loss. You probably have canker sores from not eating properly. Another stress symptom. And joint stiffness? That's what happens when you sit at a desk all day instead of exercising regularly. Every symptom I presented, he had a stress-related explanation for. It was as if he'd decided on his diagnosis before I'd even walked into the room. And nothing I could say would change his mind. I really think you should reconsider ordering some basic blood work. I said one last time, at minimum, a complete blood count and some inflammatory markers. Miss Chen, he said, his tone now openly patronizing. I understand you're concerned, but ordering unnecessary tests isn't good medicine. It's expensive. It causes anxiety while you wait for results. And frankly, it just feeds into this cycle of worry you've gotten yourself into. That was the moment I reached for my purse. Enough was enough. I pulled my medical license from my wallet first, placing it gently on Dr. Morrison's desk. The official seal of the Maryland Board of Physicians gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and my name was clearly printed. Sarah M. Chen, MD. His eyes moved from the license to my face, then back to the license. I watched the color drain from his cheeks as the implications began to sink in. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, I said calmly, department head of rheumatology at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I've been practicing medicine for 8 years, and I've published extensively on autoimmune conditions, particularly systemic lupus erythematosus. I reached into my purse again and placed my Johns Hopkins ID badge next to my license. The hospital logo was unmistakable, and my title was clearly visible beneath my photograph. Dr. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Why didn't you say something? Because, I replied, my voice steady but cold. I wanted to see how you treated a regular patient. Someone without medical credentials. Someone who couldn't advocate for herself with the same authority I can. He scrambled to look at my license again, as if it might somehow be fake or he might have misread it. Johns Hopkins, you're really a department head. I am, and in my professional capacity, I've diagnosed and treated hundreds of patients with the exact constellation of symptoms I presented to you today. The butterfly rash across my nose and cheeks. That's Malar rash, a classic presentation of systemic lupus erythematosus. The joint pain, fatigue, hair loss, and mouth ulcers, all part of the diagnostic criteria. I could see him mentally reviewing our entire interaction, realizing how badly he'd mishandled everything. The sweat beading on his forehead told me he was starting to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Dr. Morrison, I continued, in the 15 minutes I've been in this room, you've dismissed legitimate symptoms, failed to perform an adequate physical examination, refused to order appropriate diagnostic tests, and prescribed psychotropic medication for what could be a serious autoimmune condition. His hand shook slightly as he reached for my chart. We can start over. I can order those tests you mentioned. Can you? Do you even remember which tests I specifically requested? Because you weren't listening to me then, and I doubt you were taking notes about my actual symptoms rather than your predetermined diagnosis. He fumbled through the papers, and I could see his notes were minimal, probably just a few words about anxiety and stress, with no mention of the rash, hair loss, or morning stiffness I described in detail. Dr. Chen, I apologize if I seemed dismissive. Sometimes we see so many patients who are worried about things they've read online. Stop. My voice cut through his stumbling explanation. Don't compound your mistake by trying to justify it. What you did to me today, you've probably done to countless other women. The difference is they didn't have the medical knowledge to push back or the credentials to make you take notice. The room fell silent except for the sound of his nervous breathing. I let the weight of my words settle before I spoke again. The question now, Dr. Morrison, is what we're going to do about it. Dr. Morrison's attempt to regain his composure was painful to watch. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and tried to assume the authoritative tone he'd used so confidently just minutes earlier. Well, Dr. Chen, I appreciate your expertise, of course, but I still think we might be jumping to conclusions. Hair lupus is a very serious diagnosis, and we shouldn't just assume you're right. I interrupted, pulling out my phone. Let me show you why we shouldn't assume anything. I opened my research portfolio and turned the screen toward him. This is my most recent publication in the Journal of Rheumatology, Early Recognition of SLE, Diagnostic Criteria, and Clinical Presentations in Young Women. It was published 3 months ago and has already been cited 47 times. His eyes widened as he read the title, then saw my name as the lead author. I've been studying this exact presentation for the past 5 years. I continued, scrolling through my publication list. Here's another one. The cost of misdiagnosis. How gender bias delays autoimmune disease recognition. And this one, Malar rash recognition, a critical diagnostic tool in emergency and primary care settings. Each publication title seemed to hit him like a physical blow. I could see him beginning to understand that he wasn't just dealing with an angry patient. He was facing a nationally recognized expert in the exact field he'd just dismissed so casually. In my research, I said, closing my phone and leaning Forward. I've documented case after case of women presenting with early lupus symptoms being misdiagnosed with anxiety, depression, or stress-related disorders. The average time to diagnosis is 6.5 years, and in many cases, the delay leads to irreversible organ damage. I pulled my most recent research paper from my purse. I always carried copies when traveling, never knowing when I might need to reference my work. This study followed 200 women with lupus. 73% reported being told their symptoms were all in their head or related to stress before receiving their correct diagnosis. 42% developed serious complications that could have been prevented with earlier treatment. Dr. Morrison's face had gone from pale to gray. I had no idea the statistics were so what? Dr. Morrison, so damning, so clearly indicative of a systemic problem in medical care. I placed the paper on his desk, open to the section on diagnostic delays. The symptoms I presented today meet 4 of the 11 criteria for lupus diagnosis. That should have been enough to warrant immediate blood work, not a prescription for anxiety medication. He tried to read the paper, but his hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. What test should I have ordered? You should have ordered exactly what I requested, Anna. Anti-dsDNA, complement levels C3 and C4, complete blood count with differential, comprehensive metabolic panel, ESR, CRP, and urinalysis. These are standard screening tests for any patient presenting with my symptoms. I watched him write down each test, his handwriting barely legible. Dr. Morrison, I need you to understand something. I'm not just a patient you dismissed today. I'm a physician who has dedicated her career to studying exactly the kind of medical bias you just demonstrated. I testify as an expert witness in malpractice cases. I consult with hospitals on improving diagnostic accuracy. I train residents on recognizing autoimmune diseases. The implications of what I was saying weren't lost on him. He was dealing with someone who had the knowledge, credentials, and professional network to make his mistake very public and very costly. I've given grand rounds presentations at Mass General, Cleveland Clinic, and Mayo Clinic on this exact topic. I continued. The title of my most popular presentation is When Doctors Don't Listen: The Deadly Consequences of Medical Gaslighting. Dr. Morrison set down his pen and looked directly at me for the first time since I'd revealed my identity. Dr. Chen, what can I do to fix this? I pulled up my contacts and showed Dr. Morrison my phone screen. This is Dr. Michael Rodriguez, Chief of Staff at Johns Hopkins. He's also the current president of the American College of Rheumatology. I scroll down. This is Dr. Patricia Williams, chair of the Maryland Medical Board. And this is Dr. James Thompson, Director of Quality Assurance for the Mid-Atlantic region. Each name seemed to make him sink deeper into his chair. These weren't just professional contacts, these were the people who could end his career with a single phone call. Dr. Rodriguez and I have worked together on 15 research projects. I continued, putting my phone away. We co-authored the current clinical guidelines for lupus diagnosis that most hospitals use. When I tell him about today's interaction, he's going to be very interested in how a primary care physician could so completely ignore those guidelines. Dr. Morrison's voice came out as barely a whisper. You're going to report this? That depends entirely on what happens next, I said. But let me be clear about something. My professional network extends far beyond Johns Hopkins. I sit on the editorial board of 3 major medical journals. I'm a reviewer for the National Institutes of Health. I lecture at medical schools across the country about diagnostic accuracy and patient advocacy. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of my professional reputation settle in the room. Last month, I was the keynote speaker at the International Conference on Autoimmune Diseases. My presentation was called Breaking Down Barriers: How Medical Bias Kills Women. It was attended by over 2,000 physicians from around the world. The color had completely drained from his face. I understand that you're very well respected in your field, respected enough that when I speak, people listen. When I identify a problem, institutions take action. When I document a case of medical negligence, it doesn't get buried in paperwork and forgotten. I pulled out my business card and placed it on his desk next to my license and ID. See that phone number? That's my direct line when other physicians need to consult. On difficult cases, they call me. When hospitals need expert testimony about standard of care, they call me. When medical boards need specialists to review cases of potential malpractice, they call me. Dr. Morrison picked up my business card with trembling fingers, reading my credentials. Sarah M. Chen, MD, PhD, Department Head, Rheumatology, Johns Hopkins Hospital. Fellow, American College of Rheumatology. Diplomate, American Board of Internal Medicine. The PhD is in immunology from Harvard, I added. My dissertation was on autoimmune disease recognition in primary care settings. I've been studying doctors like you for over a decade. He set the card down carefully, as if it might explode. Dr. Chen, I want you to know that I never intended to. Intent doesn't matter when the outcome is the same. I interrupted. A patient came to you with serious symptoms, and you dismissed her concerns without proper examination or investigation. The fact that the patient happened to be a physician who could advocate for herself doesn't change the fundamental failure in your care. I stood up and began gathering my things. Dr. Morrison, I want you to think about something. How many other women have sat in this chair and received the same treatment? How many have been told their symptoms are just stress or anxiety? How many have left here with prescriptions for psychiatric medications instead of the medical workup they needed? He couldn't meet my eyes. I don't know. That's the problem. You don't know because you never followed up. You never wondered if you might have been wrong. You never questioned whether your first impression might have been colored by bias. I walked toward the door, then turned back. I'm going to give you one opportunity to do the right thing, Dr. Morrison. One chance to show me that this was an isolated incident and not a pattern of negligent care. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. What do you want me to do? First, I said, you're going to order every test I requested. All of them. Today. I'll wait while you put in the orders, and I'll go to the lab myself to ensure they're processed correctly. Dr. Morrison nodded frantically, reaching for his computer. Yes, of course, Anna. Anti-DS-DNA. Complement levels C3 and C4. I specified complete blood count with differential. Comprehensive metabolic panel. ESR, CRP, and urinalysis. I also want you to add anti-SM and anti-RNP antibodies to be thorough. His fingers stumbled over the keyboard as he entered each order. I watched the screen to make sure he didn't skip anything or try to modify my requests. Second, I continued, you're going to document this encounter properly. Real symptoms, real examination findings, real clinical reasoning for the tests ordered. No mention of anxiety or stress unless you can provide legitimate clinical evidence for those diagnoses. What should I write about this conversation? Write that the patient provided additional relevant medical history that changed your clinical assessment. Write that further evaluation was warranted based on the constellation of symptoms presented. 20 minutes later, I sat in the hospital lab as the phlebotomist drew 7 vials of blood. Dr. Morrison had insisted on walking me there personally, probably terrified that I might disappear and leave him wondering what would happen next. Dr. Chen, the lab tech said, reading my requisition form. These results should be available by tomorrow afternoon. Would you like us to call you directly? Please send them to both Dr. Morrison and to my email, I said, providing my Johns Hopkins address. I want to ensure we both receive them simultaneously. The next evening, I was back in my hotel room when my phone chimed with the lab results. I opened the email and felt my stomach clench. Despite having expected these findings, on positive 1 to 640, homogeneous pattern anti-DS-DNA, positive 89 UML normal less than 30 C3, 67 milligrams, DL low, normal 90 to 180 C4, 8 milligrams, DL low. Normal 10 to 40 ESR, 78 millimeters, HR elevated. Normal less than 30 CRP, 12.3 milligrams, L elevated. Normal less than 3.0. Every single marker confirmed what I'd suspected from the moment my symptoms began. I had systemic lupus erythematosus, and it was active. The complement levels were particularly concerning. Low C3 and C4 often indicated kidney involvement. My phone rang within minutes. Dr. Morrison's voice was shaky when I answered. Dr. Chen, I just received the lab results. The honor is very high, and those complement levels are consistent with active lupus nephritis. I finished. Exactly what I suspected when I first walked into your office. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. Dr. Morrison, do you understand what these results mean? That you have lupus, he said quietly. That I have lupus with possible kidney involvement. If you had prescribed anxiety medication and sent me home, if I had trusted your judgment and waited 2 weeks for a follow-up, I could have developed irreversible kidney damage. I heard him take a shaky breath. What happens now? Now I start treatment immediately. Hydroxychloroquine, low-dose prednisone, and careful monitoring. I'll need to return to Johns Hopkins for a kidney biopsy to assess the extent of renal involvement. I mean, what happens with you? I asked. That remains to be seen. These results prove that I presented with a serious medical condition that required immediate attention. Your notes from our visit will show that you diagnosed anxiety and prescribed psychiatric medication instead of ordering appropriate tests. The implications hung in the air between us. Medical malpractice cases had been built on far less egregious examples of misdiagnosis. The next morning, I walked into Millbrook's only coffee shop and immediately noticed the local newspaper on the counter. The headline made me pause. Local doctor celebrates 25 years of service. Below it was a photo of Dr. Morrison cutting a cake at what appeared to be a hospital celebration. Surrounded by smiling staff and community members, the article painted him as a pillar of the community, a dedicated physician who had chosen to serve a small town instead of pursuing more lucrative opportunities in the city. It quoted the hospital administrator, calling him an irreplaceable asset to our community's health and well-being. That's our Dr. Morrison, said the woman behind the counter, noticing my interest in the article. Such a wonderful man. He delivered both my babies and took care of my mother until the day she died. We're so lucky to have him. I ordered my coffee and found a quiet table in the corner, reading the full article while listening to the conversations around me. Dr. Dr. Morrison wasn't just a physician here, he was practically a local celebrity. People spoke about him with genuine affection and trust, sharing stories of how he'd helped their families through medical crises. But as I sat there, I began to notice something else in the conversations. Subtle comments that might have been easy to miss if I hadn't been listening for them. He told me the same thing one woman was saying to her friend. Said I was just stressed about the kids and needed to relax more. Gave me some pills for my nerves. At least he listens. Her friend replied. Dr. Peterson in the next town over just rushes you through like your cattle. Oh, Dr. Morrison listens. The first woman agreed. He just thinks most women's problems are in their heads. My sister had to drive 2 hours to the city to find someone who would actually run tests for her thyroid problems. I felt my jaw clench. This wasn't an isolated incident with me, it was a pattern. How many women in this community had received similar treatment? How many had been dismissed, medicated, and sent home without proper investigation of their symptoms? Later that afternoon, I decided to do some research of my own. I called the hospital's medical records department, identifying myself as a physician, reviewing potential consultation cases. I'm particularly interested in diagnostic patterns for female patients presenting with fatigue, joint pain, or unexplained symptoms. I explained to the records clerk what I discovered was disturbing. Over the past 5 years, Dr. Morrison had prescribed anxiety medications to over 200 female patients between the ages of 25 and 50. The diagnosis codes were overwhelmingly psychiatric, anxiety disorders, depression, adjustment disorders. In contrast, his male patients with similar complaints were much more likely to receive diagnostic workups, blood tests, imaging studies, referrals to specialists, all the things that had been denied to me and, apparently, to countless other women. I spent the evening reviewing publicly available information about the clinic's practices. Patient satisfaction surveys revealed a troubling pattern when I filtered the responses by gender. Women consistently rated their care lower than men, with frequent comments about feeling not listened to or dismissed. One review particularly caught my attention. Dr. Morrison is a nice man, but he seems to think all women's health problems are caused by stress or emotions. I had to see 3 different doctors before someone finally diagnosed my autoimmune condition. By then, I'd lost 2 years of proper treatment. Another read, if you're a woman with symptoms that aren't obvious, be prepared to be told it's anxiety. I was having heart palpitations for months before he finally ordered an EKG. Turned out I had a serious arrhythmia that could have killed me. The picture that emerged was clear. Dr. Morrison had built his reputation on being a caring, dedicated small-town doctor, but his care was fundamentally biased. Male patients received thorough evaluations, while female patients received psychological explanations for their physical symptoms. This wasn't just about my misdiagnosis anymore. This was about a systematic pattern of medical negligence that had been hiding in plain sight, protected by the doctor's reputation and the community's loyalty. I realized that my decision about what to do next would affect far more than just Dr. Morrison's career. It could change how dozens of women in this community received medical care. For years to come, I couldn't let this go. My clinical training and research background had taught me to look for patterns, and what I was seeing demanded further investigation. I made some calls to colleagues who specialized in medical quality assurance and healthcare data analysis. Sarah, what you're describing sounds like textbook gender bias in medical care, said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a health policy researcher at Georgetown. If you can document the pattern statistically, you might have grounds for a much larger investigation. She helped me understand how to request de-identified aggregate data from the clinic through legitimate research channels. As a department head at Johns Hopkins, with published research in healthcare disparities, I had the credentials to request such information for a potential study. The data that came back was even more damning than I'd expected. Over the past 7 years, Dr. Morrison had prescribed psychotropic medications to 347 female patients for symptoms that, in male patients, had prompted diagnostic testing. The disparity was stark and statistically significant. Women presenting with chest pain, 73%, received anxiety medications, 27% received cardiac workups. Men presenting with chest pain, 8% received anxiety medications, 92% received cardiac workups. Women presenting with fatigue and joint pain, 89% received psychiatric diagnoses. 11% received autoimmune screening. Men presenting with fatigue and joint pain, 23% received psychiatric diagnoses. 77% received autoimmune screening. The pattern held across virtually every symptom category. Dr. Morrison was systematically undertreating female patients while providing appropriate care to male patients with identical complaints. But the most shocking discovery came when I cross-referenced the clinic's data with hospital admission records from the regional medical center. 47 women who had been treated by Dr. Morrison for anxiety or stress-related disorders had subsequently been hospitalized within 2 years for serious medical conditions that should have been detectable during their initial presentations. 3 women had been hospitalized for heart attacks after being treated for anxiety-related chest pain. 5 had required emergency surgery for conditions that could have been managed medically if caught earlier. 2 had developed kidney failure from undiagnosed autoimmune diseases. One case file made me physically nauseous. Jennifer Martinez, a 28-year-old teacher, had presented to Dr. Morrison with fatigue, weight loss, and persistent cough. She'd been diagnosed with work-related stress and prescribed anti-anxiety medication. 6 months later, she was hospitalized with stage 4 lung cancer. She died 3 weeks after her diagnosis. I found myself wondering if Jennifer had been John Martinez instead of Jennifer. Would Dr. Morrison have ordered a chest X-ray during that initial visit? Would she still be alive? The more I dug, the more evidence I found of preventable harm. Women whose symptoms had been dismissed, whose conditions had progressed untreated, whose lives had been irreversibly altered by delayed diagnoses. I called Dr. Morrison's office and scheduled another appointment. Dr. Chen, I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon, he said when I walked into his office. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't been sleeping well since our last encounter. I've been doing some research, Dr. Morrison. Research that I think you need to see. I placed a folder on his desk containing the statistical analysis of his prescribing patterns, stripped of patient identifiers, but showing clear evidence of gender bias. In his diagnostic practices, his face went pale as he reviewed the data. Where did you get this information? Through legitimate research channels? I'm a healthcare researcher, Dr. Morrison. This is what I do. I study patterns of medical care and identify areas for improvement. I opened to the page showing hospitalization rates for his former patients. These are women you treated for anxiety or stress-related conditions who were subsequently hospitalized for serious medical conditions that might have been detected if they'd received the same level of diagnostic attention you routinely provide to male patients. He couldn't speak, staring at the numbers with growing horror. Double quotes Dr. Morrison. I need you to understand something. This isn't just about my misdiagnosis anymore. This is about a pattern of care that has potentially harmed dozens of women in your community. Women who trusted you with their health and received substandard treatment because of unconscious bias. I leaned forward, my voice steady but firm. The question now is, what are you going to do about it? That night, I sat in my hotel room staring at my laptop screen. The cursor blinked in the email composition window, waiting for me to decide what to write and who to send it to. I had enough evidence to destroy Dr. Morrison's career, to trigger investigations that would likely result in malpractice lawsuits, license suspension, and the end of his 25-year practice in Millbrook. Part of me wanted to do exactly that. The physician in me was outraged by the pattern of negligent care. The researcher in me was appalled by the systematic bias. The woman in me was furious about all the female patients who had been dismissed and endangered. But another part of me kept thinking about the coffee shop conversations, the genuine affection this community had for Dr. Morrison, the stories of lives he'd saved, families he'd helped through crises. He wasn't evil. He was biased. He wasn't malicious. He was ignorant of his own prejudices. I thought about my own journey in medicine, the unconscious biases I'd had to confront and overcome. Medical school and residency had trained all of us in ways that perpetuated gender disparities in healthcare. The difference was that some of us had learned to recognize and correct those biases, while others remained blind to them. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Dr. Morrison. Dr. Chen, I've been thinking about what you showed me today, he said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like genuine remorse. I can't stop looking at those numbers, those women who were hospitalized. If I had done things differently, if you had provided the same standard of care to female patients that you provided to male patients, some of those hospitalizations might have been prevented, I said quietly. I never realized I was doing that. I never thought I was treating men and women differently. That's the insidious thing about unconscious bias, Dr. Morrison. By definition, we're not aware we're doing it, but the impact on patients is the same whether the bias is conscious or not. There was a long silence before he spoke again. What happens now? Are you going to report me to the medical board? I closed my laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet streets of Millbrook. I'm going to give you a choice, Dr. Morrison. You can continue practicing the way you always have, and I'll file a formal complaint with the Maryland Medical Board, along with my research documenting the pattern of biased care. That complaint will likely trigger a full investigation, possible disciplinary action, and certainly a lot of negative publicity for you and this clinic. I heard him take a shaky breath. Or, I continued, you can commit to making real changes, systematic changes that address the underlying biases in your practice and ensure that female patients receive the same quality of care as male patients. What kind of changes? First, you would agree to undergo formal training on implicit bias in medical settings. There are excellent programs designed specifically for practicing physicians. Second, you would implement systematic changes to your diagnostic protocols to ensure consistency regardless of patient gender. Third, you would establish a patient advocacy program to give patients a way to voice concerns about their care. I paused, letting him absorb what I was proposing. And fourth, you would agree to have your practice patterns monitored for the next 2 years by an independent quality assurance program. Regular audits to ensure that the changes are being implemented and sustained. You would really give me that option after what I did to you, Dr. Morrison. My goal isn't to destroy your career. My goal is to improve health care for women in this community and beyond. If you're willing to genuinely address the problems in your practice, I believe that serves my patients and future patients better than simply punishing you. I sat back down at my laptop and opened a new document. I'm going to draft a formal agreement outlining these requirements. If you sign it and follow through on every commitment, I won't file a complaint with the medical board. But if you fail to implement these changes, or if I find evidence that the biased care continues, I'll take action immediately. Dr. Chen, why would you do this for me? I'm not doing it for you. I said firmly, I'm doing it for every woman who will walk into your office after today. They deserve better care than what I received, and what dozens of women before me received. This is about them, not you. I spent the next 3 days crafting the most comprehensive quality improvement agreement I'd ever written, drawing on my experience with hospital accreditation and medical quality standards. I created a document that would fundamentally transform how Dr. Morrison's practice operated. The agreement required him to complete a 40-hour training program on implicit bias in healthcare within 60 days. Not just a simple online course, but an intensive program that included practical exercises, case studies, and ongoing mentorship from specialists in healthcare equity. I specified that all diagnostic decisions would be documented according to evidence-based protocols, with clear clinical reasoning required for any deviation from standard care pathways. If a female patient presented with chest pain, Dr. Morrison would need to document why he didn't order cardiac testing, not just assume it was anxiety. The patient advocacy component was particularly important to me. I designed a system where patients could request a second opinion or additional testing without going through Dr. Morrison directly. A nurse practitioner would be empowered to order tests and make referrals based on patient concerns, creating a safety net for cases where unconscious bias might influence care. But the most critical element was the monitoring system. I reached out to Dr. Patricia Williams at the Maryland Medical Board not to file a complaint, but to request their assistance in implementing a voluntary quality improvement program. Sarah, this is fascinating, Dr. Williams said during our phone call. You're essentially creating a rehabilitation program instead of pursuing punitive action. The medical board is very interested in this approach. She agreed to provide oversight for the monitoring program, with quarterly reviews of Dr. Morrison's practice patterns and patient outcomes. If the data showed continued bias or poor outcomes, the board would step in with formal disciplinary action. I also contacted Dr. Angela Ross, a healthcare quality consultant who specialized in bias reduction programs. She agreed to design and implement the training program specifically for Dr. Morrison's practice. What you're proposing could serve as a model for other physicians, Dr. Ross told me. Most bias reduction efforts happen at the institutional level. This individual-focused approach could be very effective. The economic analysis was sobering. The training program, monitoring system, and quality improvements would cost Dr. Morrison approximately $75,000 over 2 years. But when I calculated the potential cost of malpractice suits, license suspension, and practice closure, the investment seemed modest. I presented the final agreement to Dr. Morrison on a Friday afternoon. The document was 15 pages long, with detailed requirements, timelines, and consequences for non-compliance. This is extensive, he said, flipping through the pages. Changing ingrained practice patterns requires extensive intervention. I replied, half measures won't work. Either you commit fully to this process, or we proceed with formal disciplinary action. He read through each section carefully, asking questions about specific requirements and timelines. I could see him beginning to understand the magnitude of what I was proposing. Not just changes to his diagnostic practices, but a fundamental transformation of how he approached patient care. The monitoring system, he said, pointing to that section. Someone will be reviewing every case I handle for 2 years, every diagnosis, every treatment decision, every outcome will be analyzed for evidence of bias or substandard care. The data will be compared to evidence-based standards and to your own historical practice patterns. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. Dr. Morrison, if you sign this agreement, there will be nowhere to hide, no more dismissing women's symptoms without consequences, no more prescribing psychiatric medications without proper diagnostic workups. No more practicing medicine the way you have for the past 25 years. He set the document down and rubbed his face with both hands. This will change everything about how I practice. That's exactly the point. The question is, are you willing to change? Or would you prefer to defend your current practices to the medical board? The room fell silent as he contemplated his options. I could see him weighing the cost of change against the cost of resistance, calculating whether his career could survive either path. Finally, he picked up his pen. Where do I sign? Word about Dr. Morrison's new training program spread through Millbrook faster than I had anticipated. Small towns have their own communication networks, and within a week of his signing the agreement, rumors were flying about why the beloved local doctor was suddenly attending medical conferences and hiring additional staff. I decided to stay in town for another week to observe how the community was responding to the changes. What I found was a fascinating mix of support, confusion, and resistance dot at the coffee shop. I overheard two women discussing their recent appointments with Dr. Morrison. He was so different. One was saying, asked me all these detailed questions about my headaches, ordered blood work, even referred me to a specialist. I've been complaining about these headaches for 2 years, and he always said it was just stress. Same thing happened to me. Her friend replied, I went in for fatigue. And instead of telling me to get more sleep, he ran a whole bunch of tests. Found out I'm anemic. Said he should have checked that months ago. But not everyone was pleased with the changes at the grocery store. I listened to an older man complaining to the pharmacist. Dr. Morrison's gotten too fancy for his own good, he grumbled. Used to be you could get in and out of there in 15 minutes. Now he wants to run tests for everything, asks a million questions, probably trying to make more money with all these unnecessary procedures. The pharmacist, a middle-aged woman, disagreed. My daughter finally got diagnosed with that thyroid condition after years of being told it was depression. Sometimes more testing is a good thing. Social media provided another window into community sentiment. The clinic's Facebook page had become a battleground of opinions. Some patients praised the improved care and thoroughness, while others complained about longer wait times and increased costs. One post particularly caught my attention. To whoever convinced Dr. Morrison to take women's health concerns seriously, thank you. I finally got answers about my joint pain after 3 years of being told to exercise more and SS less. Turns out I have rheumatoid arthritis. Early treatment might save my hands. But there was also pushback. Dr. Morrison used to know his patients. Now he treats everyone like they're strangers, ordering tests for every little thing. This town is losing its personal touch thanks to outside influence. I realized that some community members had figured out that an outside doctor had triggered these changes, though they didn't know my identity. The speculation ranged from conspiracy theories about government oversight to rumors about malpractice threats. Dr. Morrison called me on Thursday evening, his voice strained. Dr. Chen, I need to tell you about something that happened today, Mrs. Henderson. She's been my patient for 15 years, came in complaining that I'm not the same doctor anymore. She said I used to understand her, and now I'm treating her like a number. What was she seeking treatment for? I asked. Chest pain. She wanted me to prescribe her usual anxiety medication, but I followed the new protocols and ordered an EKG and cardiac enzymes, and the EKG showed some abnormalities. I had to refer her to cardiology for further evaluation. She was furious. Said I was making her worry unnecessarily about her heart when she knows it's just stress. I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Dr. Morrison, are you having second thoughts about our agreement? No, it's not that. It's just, this is harder than I expected. Changing how I practice means disappointing some patients who were comfortable with the old way. Some patients will resist evidence-based care because it challenges their preconceptions, I said. But Mrs. Henderson's EKG abnormalities suggest that her chest pain might not be anxiety after all. You potentially just prevented a heart attack. The next day, I got my answer about Mrs. Henderson. Dr. Morrison called to tell me that the cardiologist had found significant coronary artery disease, requiring immediate intervention. She was scheduled for cardiac catheterization the following week. She called to apologize. He said quietly, said she never would have forgiven herself if she'd ignored the chest pain and had a heart attack. She thanked me for insisting on the testing even when she didn't want it. That's why evidence-based medicine exists, Dr. Morrison. It removes personal bias and emotional reactions from clinical decision-making. Mrs. Henderson is alive because you followed protocols instead of assumptions. By the end of that week, the community narrative was beginning to shift. Word spread about Mrs. Henderson's near miss, and other patients started sharing stories about conditions that had been caught early thanks to Dr. Morrison's new thoroughness. The resistance didn't disappear entirely, but it was increasingly overshadowed by gratitude from patients who were finally receiving appropriate care. 3 months after Dr. Morrison signed the agreement, Dr. Patricia Williams from the Maryland Medical Board conducted her first formal review of his practice. I flew in from Baltimore to participate in the assessment, curious to see how the changes were being implemented. The review was thorough and systematic. Dr. Williams and her team examined 200 randomly selected patient cases from the 3 months since the agreement went into effect, comparing them to historical patterns and evidence-based standards of care. The improvement is remarkable, Dr. Williams told me as we reviewed the preliminary findings. The gender disparity in diagnostic testing has essentially disappeared. Male and female patients are now receiving equivalent levels of diagnostic workup for similar presentations. The numbers were striking. In the 3 months since implementing the new protocols, Dr. Morrison had ordered diagnostic tests for 94% of female patients presenting with chest pain, compared to his historical rate of 27%. The rate for male patients had remained consistently high at 96%. For fatigue and joint pain complaints, 87% of female patients now received appropriate screening tests, compared to the historical rate of 11%. The monitoring system was working exactly as designed. But perhaps more important than the statistics were the individual case reviews. Dr. Williams pulled up several files on her laptop. This is Maria Santos, 32 years old, presented with fatigue and hair loss under Dr. Morrison's old patterns. She would have received a diagnosis of postpartum depression and been prescribed antidepressants. Instead, he ordered a complete thyroid panel and discovered severe hypothyroidism. She clicked to another case. Jennifer Park, 29, chest pain and palpitations. Previously would have been diagnosed with anxiety. Dr. Morrison ordered an echocardiogram and found mitral valve prolapse, requiring cardiology follow-up. Case after case showed the same pattern. Symptoms that would have been dismissed as psychological were now being properly investigated, leading to real medical diagnoses and appropriate treatment. Dr. Morrison has identified and properly treated more medical conditions in the past 3 months than in the previous 2 years combined, Dr. Williams observed, at least among his female patients. The patient satisfaction surveys told an even more compelling story. Women's ratings of their care had improved dramatically, with particular improvements in feeling heard and taken seriously by their physician. One comment stood out. Dr. Morrison actually listened to my concerns and didn't just assume I was being emotional. He found the real cause of my symptoms, and I'm finally getting better. I wish all doctors cared this much about their patients. Dr. Morrison joined us for the feedback session, looking nervous but determined. I have to admit, he said, this process has been eye-opening. I never realized how differently I was treating male and female patients. The training program Dr. Ross designed has made me aware of biases I didn't even know I had. Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. The question is, how sustainable are these changes? Will you be able to maintain this level of care without the intensive monitoring? I think so, he replied. The new protocols have become routine now, and honestly, I'm catching more real medical problems than I ever did before. It's made me a better doctor. I had been quiet during most of the review, but now I spoke up. Dr. Morrison, what's been the most challenging aspect of this process? He thought for a moment. Admitting that I was wrong, that I had been providing substandard care to half my patients for years without realizing it. That's been harder than any of the technical changes. Dr. Williams made notes in her report. The next review will be in 6 months. We'll be looking for continued improvement and sustainability of the changes based on what I've seen today. Dr. Morrison, you should be proud of the progress you've made. After Dr. Williams left, Dr. Morrison and I sat in his office reviewing the assessment results. Dr. Chen, I need to ask you something, he said. Do you think I can ever make up for the harm I caused with my previous practices? The women who didn't get proper diagnoses, who suffered because of my biases. I considered his question carefully. You can't change the past, Dr. Morrison, but you can ensure that no future patient experiences what I experienced or what those other women experienced. That's your responsibility now. I want to do more, he said. I want to help other physicians recognize their own biases before they cause harm. Would you be willing to help me develop a presentation about this experience? I was surprised by his request, but also impressed by his commitment to broader change. I think that's an excellent idea. Let's talk about how we can turn your experience into a learning opportunity for other physicians. 6 months after our initial confrontation, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Morrison. His voice was tight with anxiety when I answered. Dr. Chen, I need to tell you about something that happened today. Dr. Richards from the neighboring practice has been asking questions about my sudden changes in practice patterns. He's been telling other physicians that I'm being influenced by outside pressure and that I'm over-testing patients unnecessarily. Dr. Richards was a physician I'd heard about during my research, another small-town doctor with similar practice patterns to Dr. Morrison's historical approach. Apparently, word of the changes in Millbrook had spread to the broader medical community. What specifically did he say? I asked. He suggested that I was being manipulated by someone with an agenda, that I was abandoning my clinical judgment in favor of unnecessary protocols. He said he'd heard rumors about a complaint that was filed and then withdrawn, and that I was probably just trying to avoid trouble. I felt my anger rising. Dr. Morrison, are you having doubts about the changes you've made? No, absolutely not. The data speaks for itself. I'm providing better care now than I ever did before. But Dr. Richards is influential in this region, and I'm worried that he might try to undermine what we've accomplished 2 days later. I received a call that confirmed my worst fears. Dr. Richards had contacted the Maryland Medical Board, suggesting that Dr. Morrison was being coerced into unnecessary practice changes by an outside physician with questionable motives. Dr. Patricia Williams called me directly. Sarah, we've received some concerning allegations about your agreement with Dr. Morrison. Dr. Richards is claiming that you threatened Dr. Morrison with false accusations to force him into compliance with unnecessary protocols. I felt my blood pressure spike. That's absolutely untrue. I have documentation of everything: the original misdiagnosis, the pattern of biased care, the voluntary agreement Dr. Morrison signed. Nothing was coerced. I believe you, but we need to address these. ALLEGATIONS formally. Dr. Richards has requested a hearing to review the entire situation. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. I flew back to Maryland with a complete file of documentation, my original lab results, Dr. Morrison's initial notes, the statistical analysis of his practice patterns, patient outcome data, and every piece of correspondence related to our agreement. Dr. Richards arrived at the medical board offices with his own attorney, and a folder full of what he claimed was evidence of coercion and professional misconduct on my part. He was a tall, imposing man in his 60s with the kind of authoritative presence that probably served him well. In dismissing patient concerns, Dr. Chen used her position and credentials to intimidate Dr. Morrison into abandoning sound clinical judgment. Dr. Richards argued during his presentation. She manufactured a crisis where none existed and forced unnecessary changes that have disrupted quality medical care in our region. I listened to his accusations with growing outrage. He painted me as an outsider who had manipulated a respected local physician, ignoring the documented evidence of biased care and improved patient outcomes. When it was my turn to respond, I stood and placed my research on the table. Dr. Richards, you claim I manufactured a crisis. Let me show you the real crisis. I opened to the page showing Dr. Morrison's historical practice patterns. These statistics demonstrate systematic gender bias in diagnostic care that put women's lives at risk. I walked through each piece of evidence methodically. My own misdiagnosis, the pattern of different care for male and female patients, the hospitalizations that could have been prevented, and the dramatic improvements since the protocols were implemented. Dr. Richards, I said, turning to face him directly. You suggest that Dr. Morrison was providing sound clinical judgment before our agreement. Do you believe that prescribing anxiety medication for lupus symptoms constitutes sound clinical judgment? His face reddened. One case doesn't establish a pattern. You're right. One case doesn't establish a pattern, but 347 cases of female patients receiving psychiatric diagnoses for symptoms that prompted diagnostic testing in male patients does establish a pattern. I could see Dr. Williams and the other board members reviewing the statistical analysis with growing concern. Furthermore, I continued, the improvements in patient care since implementing evidence-based protocols speak for themselves. Dr. Morrison is now identifying and treating medical conditions that were previously missed. Patient satisfaction has improved dramatically. Hospital admission rates for preventable complications have decreased. Dr. Richards tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. Dr. Richards, I'm curious about your own practice patterns. Have you ever analyzed the gender disparities in your diagnostic decisions? Because if you're defending Dr. Morrison's historical practices, I have to wonder if you're providing the same biased care to your own patients. The room fell silent. Dr. Richards looked like he'd been slapped. I resent the implication. It's not an implication, I said firmly. It's a direct question. Are you willing to have your practice patterns reviewed the same way Dr. Morrison's were? Dr. Williams leaned forward. That's actually an excellent suggestion, Dr. Richards. Since you're questioning the validity of our findings regarding gender bias in medical care, perhaps you'd be willing to participate in a similar analysis of your own practice. The color drained from Dr. Richards' face. That's not necessary. My practice methods are sound. Then you should have no objection to demonstrating that with data. I replied. The hearing ended with Dr. Richards refusing to submit to practice pattern analysis and withdrawing his complaints against both Dr. Morrison and me. As he left the conference room, I heard him mutter something about troublemakers and activists ruining medicine. Dr. Morrison, who had been silent through most of the proceedings, finally spoke up. Double quotes Dr. Richards. I need you to understand something. Dr. Chen didn't force me to change anything. She showed me evidence that I was providing substandard care to half my patients. The changes I made weren't coerced, they were necessary. He stood up, his voice gaining strength. I'm a better doctor now than I was 6 months ago. My patients are healthier because I learned to recognize my own biases. If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why. The Maryland Medical Board hearing had an impact far beyond just vindicating our approach. Within weeks, Dr. Williams contacted me with an unexpected proposal. Sarah, the board has been discussing your case extensively. We'd like to pilot a statewide program based on the model you created with Dr. Morrison. We're calling it the Healthcare Equity Initiative. The program would offer physicians the opportunity to undergo voluntary bias assessment and remediation instead of facing disciplinary action for gender disparate care. It was exactly what I had hoped would come from our experienced systemic change that could benefit patients across Maryland. We want you to lead the program. Dr. Williams continued. Design the protocols, oversee the training components, and establish the monitoring systems. This could transform how we address unconscious bias in medical practice. I was honored, but also concerned about the scope of such an undertaking. Dr. Williams, this would require a significant time commitment. I'd need to take a sabbatical from Johns Hopkins. We've already discussed that with Dr. Rodriguez. The hospital is fully supportive of this initiative. They see it as an extension of your research in healthcare disparities. Over the next 6 months, I worked with a team of healthcare quality experts, biostatisticians, and bias reduction specialists to develop comprehensive guidelines for the Healthcare Equity Initiative. We created standardized assessment tools, evidence-based training curricula, and robust monitoring systems. The pilot program launched with 12 participating physicians across Maryland, all of whom had been identified through routine practice. pattern audits as having significant gender disparities in their care. Instead of facing disciplinary action, they were offered the opportunity to participate in our remediation program. Dr. Morrison volunteered to serve as a mentor for other physicians entering the program. His transformation from resistant skeptic to bias reduction advocate had been remarkable to witness. Dr. Chen, I want to share something with you, he said during one of our regular check-in calls. Yesterday, a 35-year-old woman came to my office with fatigue and joint pain. 6 months ago, I would have diagnosed her with stress and prescribed anxiety medication. Instead, I ordered the appropriate tests and discovered she has early-stage rheumatoid arthritis. Because we caught it early, she has an excellent prognosis with proper treatment. These success stories were becoming routine as the program expanded. Participating physicians were identifying conditions they had previously missed, providing more comprehensive care, and reporting higher job satisfaction as they became more skilled diagnosticians. The patient advocacy component proved particularly valuable. Nurse practitioners specially trained in medical bias were embedded in participating practices, empowered to order additional testing or referrals when patients felt their concerns weren't being adequately addressed. It's like having a safety net. One patient told me during a program evaluation interview, I know that if I feel like I'm not being heard, there's someone else I can talk to who will take my concerns seriously. The program's success attracted national attention. Medical journals published our outcome data, showing significant improvements in diagnostic accuracy, patient satisfaction, and health outcomes for female patients. Healthcare systems from other states began inquiring about implementing similar programs. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The American Medical Women's Association awarded me their Distinguished Service Award for Advancing Gender Equity in Healthcare. Dr. Chen, the association president, said during the awards ceremony, your work has demonstrated that individual physicians can change, that healthcare systems can improve, and that patients' lives can be saved when we address bias head-on instead of ignoring it. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of physician colleagues, I thought about how this journey had started with my own experience of being dismissed and misdiagnosed in a small town clinic. What had begun as personal frustration had evolved into systemic change that was improving care for women across the country. Change is possible, I said in my acceptance speech, but it requires courage to confront our own biases, courage to challenge systems that perpetuate disparities, and courage to advocate for patients who may not be able to advocate for themselves. The Healthcare Equity Initiative was now being implemented in 8 states, with federal funding secured for a national expansion. What had started as one physician's decision to stand up for proper medical care had become a movement transforming healthcare delivery across America. 2 years after that first confrontation with Dr. Morrison, I received a letter that stopped me in my tracks. The return address showed it was from Millbrook, but the sender's name was unfamiliar. Rebecca Thompson. Dear Dr. Chen, the letter began. You don't know me, but you saved my life. I was one of the women Dr. Morrison treated for anxiety before you helped him change his practices. Last month, he caught my breast cancer during a routine examination because he was finally doing thorough physical exams on all his patients. The oncologist said that if it had gone undetected for another 6 months, the outcome would have been very different. I sat in my office at Johns Hopkins, holding the letter with tears in my eyes. This was why I had fought so hard not for recognition or vindication, but for women like Rebecca who deserve the same quality of care as any other patient. The letter continued. I heard through the grapevine that you were the doctor who made Dr. Morrison realize he needed to change. I wanted you to know that your courage to speak up didn't just affect you, it probably saved dozens of lives here in Millbrook. Thank you for caring enough about strangers to take a stand. Rebecca's letter was one of many I had received over the past 2 years. Women from across Maryland and beyond had written to thank me for the Healthcare Equity Initiative, sharing stories of conditions that were finally diagnosed properly, symptoms that were finally taken seriously, and lives that were literally saved by physicians who had learned to recognize their own biases. But the personal cost had been significant. Leading the initiative had required a year-long sabbatical from my research at Johns Hopkins, delaying several important studies, the time spent traveling to conferences, training physicians, and advocating for policy changes had taken me away from the laboratory work I loved. My own lupus management had become more challenging during this period. The stress of fighting systemic bias while managing a chronic autoimmune condition had triggered several flares, requiring adjustments to my treatment regimen and reminders that I couldn't pour from an empty cup. Sarah, you can't save everyone. My rheumatologist, Dr. Amanda Foster, had reminded me during a particularly difficult flare. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary for you to continue the work you're doing. The experience had also changed my relationships with colleagues. Some admired my advocacy work, while others questioned whether I had become too political for academic medicine. The medical establishment was still uncomfortable with physicians who challenged systemic problems too directly, but it had also brought unexpected opportunities. Harvard Medical School had offered me a position as the inaugural director of their Center for Healthcare Equity. The National Institutes of Health had funded a 5-year study I proposed on bias reduction in medical education. Medical students were writing to ask about training opportunities in healthcare advocacy. Most importantly, the experience had clarified my purpose as a physician. I was no longer just treating individual patients with autoimmune diseases. I was treating the systemic diseases that affected healthcare delivery itself. My relationship with my family had evolved as well. My parents finally seemed to understand that my career wasn't just about personal success, it was about making a difference in other people's lives. When my mother saw a news article about the Healthcare Equity Initiative, she called me with pride in her voice for the first time I could remember. "Sarah, I never understood why you chose such a difficult path," she said, "but reading about all the women you've helped, I'm proud of what you've accomplished." Even my siblings had begun to see my work differently. Michael, my accountant brother, helped me understand the financial implications of healthcare disparities. Lisa used her HR experience to help design workplace accommodations for physicians managing chronic conditions while leading bias reduction efforts. I kept Rebecca's letter on my desk as a reminder of why this work mattered. Every time I felt exhausted by committee meetings, frustrated by institutional resistance, or overwhelmed by the scope of systemic change needed, I would read her words again. "You saved my life." Those four words made every challenge worth it. They reminded me that medicine at its best was about more than diagnosing diseases. It was about ensuring that every patient, regardless of gender, race, or social status, received the compassionate, evidence-based care they deserved. The scared, dismissed patient who had walked into Dr. Morrison's office 2 years ago was gone. In her place was a physician advocate who understood that sometimes the most important healing happened not in exam rooms, but in changing the systems that shaped how medicine was practiced. 3 years later, I stood in the auditorium at Johns Hopkins Medical School, looking out at 150 first-year medical students eager to begin their clinical rotations. As the new director of the Center for Healthcare Equity, this lecture on recognizing and addressing medical bias had become a required part of the curriculum. How many of you have ever had a medical concern dismissed by a healthcare provider? I asked. About half the hands in the room went up, a sobering reminder that even future physicians weren't immune to biased care. Today, I want to tell you about a patient named Sarah. I began using my own story as a case study. She presented with fatigue, joint pain, hair loss, and a distinctive facial rash. "What diagnosis would you consider?" The students called out the obvious answers: lupus, autoimmune disease, SLE. Exactly. Now let me tell you what actually happened when Sarah sought medical care. I walked them through my experience with Dr. Morrison, watching their expressions change from confidence to dismay as they realized how obvious symptoms could be completely overlooked when filtered through unconscious bias. The physician in this case wasn't malicious, I explained. He wasn't intentionally providing poor care, but his unconscious biases about women, stress, and emotional complaints led him to misdiagnose a serious autoimmune condition as anxiety. I showed them the data from our healthcare equity initiative, hundreds of physicians who had learned to recognize their biases and dramatically improved their patient care as a result. The good news, I continued, is that bias can be addressed. Physicians can learn to recognize their unconscious prejudices and implement systems that ensure consistent, evidence-based care for all patients. After the lecture, a young woman approached me. Dr. Chen, I've been experiencing some of the symptoms you described: joint pain, fatigue, some hair loss. I saw a doctor last month who told me it was probably stress from starting medical school. I felt that familiar surge of protective anger, but I channeled it into action. Let's get you connected with one of our rheumatology residents for a proper evaluation. Medical school is stressful, but that doesn't mean physical symptoms should be dismissed. This had become routine. Medical students, residents, and even faculty members seeking me out when they felt their health concerns weren't being taken seriously. The Center for Healthcare Equity had become not just a research and training institute, but a safe haven for anyone who had experienced biased medical care. That evening, I received a call from Dr. Morrison. Our quarterly check-ins had evolved into genuine friendship over the years, and he had become one of the most effective advocates for bias reduction in primary care. Sarah, I wanted to let you know about something wonderful that happened today, he said, excitement clear in his voice. Remember Jennifer Martinez, the teacher who died of lung cancer after I missed her diagnosis? I remember the case vividly, one of the most heartbreaking examples of delayed diagnosis in my research. Her daughter, Maria, just started working as a nurse practitioner in our patient advocacy program. She told me that watching her mother struggle to get proper medical care inspired her to become a healthcare provider herself. She wants to make sure no other family goes through what hers did. Stories like these had become the foundation of our program's success. People who had experienced medical bias were often the most passionate advocates for change, bringing lived experience to complement our research and training efforts. There's something else, Dr. Morrison continued. The medical board just approved our proposal to make bias reduction training mandatory for license renewal across Maryland. We're the first state to require it. This was the kind of systemic change I had dreamed of when I first walked out of Dr. Morrison's office 3 years ago. Instead of addressing bias on a case-by-case basis, we were building it into the fundamental requirements of medical practice. My own lupus was well controlled now, managed through a combination of medication, stress reduction techniques, and the deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work. The irony wasn't lost on me that the stress-related flares Dr. Morrison might have attributed to my emotional nature had largely resolved once I found my true calling in healthcare advocacy. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. What had started as a personal experience of medical dismissal had evolved into a career dedicated to ensuring that no patient would face the same dismissal I had experienced. The scared woman who had sat in Dr. Morrison's office, being told her symptoms were just anxiety, had discovered something powerful when patients advocate for themselves and each other, when physicians commit to confronting their biases, and when institutions prioritize equity over comfort. Real change becomes possible. Tomorrow, I would teach another group of medical students about recognizing bias. I would review applications from physicians seeking to join our remediation program. I would analyze data showing continued improvements in gender equitable care across Maryland and beyond. But tonight, I simply felt grateful for the courage to speak up when it mattered, grateful for Dr. Morrison's willingness to change, grateful for every patient who would receive better care because we had been brave enough to acknowledge that medicine could and must do better. The fight for healthcare equity was far from over, but we had proven that change was possible, one physician, one patient, one difficult conversation at a time. Share your own healthcare advocacy stories in the comments below. Together, we can continue building a medical system that truly serves all patients with the respect and thoroughness they deserve.